Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to those of you who are just joining. We are going to get started in a few minutes here. I'm going to give a second for a few more folks to log on. In the meantime, I would love to see kind of who is joining us today. So if you would put in the chat just your name and where you are watching from, make sure to select the option that says send to all panelists and attendees. And that way everyone can see it. And that would be a great way to just introduce yourself and let us know kind of in the chat where you're from. We've already got lots of Minnesotans, somebody from Nebraska, I think I saw, all over the state. Wisconsin as well, so some great Midwestern supporters. Well, as folks continue to introduce themselves, I will go ahead and get started. My name is Maya Swope. I am the outreach coordinator here at Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. We're really excited that you're able to join us for this Earth Day presentation. I know Earth Day is officially next week, but we wanted to host this session today to provide a space to kind of think about 51 years of Earth Day, what that has looked like, and what that means for the future of wilderness protection, for the boundary waters, and for our work to help protect clean water. I know the original Earth Days were really focused around environmental health and safety and clean air and clean water. And that is a theme and a trend that really is still relevant today, even though kind of the fight for that looks very different. So we have some awesome panelists who are going to help us kind of discuss this and be reflective of this today. So I will introduce a few of them in just a second. First, I wanted to mention a few kind of Zoom things here. There is a chat at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to, again, keep introducing yourselves. You can also send me a message if you're having any technology issues, and I can try to help troubleshoot that. We also have a Q&A feature, again, at the bottom of the screen. And that Q&A feature is a great place for you to enter anything that you want the panel to address, whether that's a specific question or a topic that you think we should be mentioning throughout this. That Q&A will be a great place for that. That is kind of all of the housekeeping stuff I have for you all. So I'll go ahead and get started with a few brief introductions and then let the panelists kind of explain and introduce themselves more. So we have with us today former Minnesota Governor Arne Carlson, who is a political leader and has been a great advocate for the boundary waters. We have Chuck Dayton, who was involved in some of the first Earth Day celebrations here in Minnesota and is also really crucial in founding Friends of the Boundary Waters and getting kind of this fight for the boundary waters kicked off. We're joined by Claire Shirley, who is the owner of Sawbell Canoe Outfitters up near the boundary waters and has been a resident of northern Minnesota and takes her kids out into the boundary waters, and it's a great perspective there. Also joined by Sarah Bransford, who has a lot of experience leading trips in the boundary waters, working with Camp Minogen, and is an environmental educator as well. And then finally, we've got Nayana Gurun, who is a high school student in East St. Paul and has been an environmental activist and advocate, working to bring more kids up to the boundary waters and kind of working on environmental justice issues associated with that. So that's who we've got here today. Excited to hear from all of you. I wanted to start with Governor Carlson. If you could just kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about, why you're here and your connection to the boundary waters.
Well, let me do this, if I may, instead. Let me just launch into a discussion on Earth Day. Traditionally, Earth Day is the time when you look back and pat yourself on the back and say, isn't it wonderful, the marvelous things that we've done relative to clean water, air, etc. It was used as a time, if you will, to commemorate our accomplishments and then to spend some time focusing on tomorrow. I think Earth Day now needs to be significantly different. We're not talking about environmental issues. We're talking about whether or not mankind has the capacity to make the decisions to prevent its own extinction. We've been told by science that we have roughly 12, maybe 15 years to make the changes necessary in order to correct the course that we're currently on. Today, as we sit here, Japan is announcing that nuclear waste will be dumped into our oceans. Tampa Bay is going through what they politely call a leak from mining debris, which also is nuclear and toxic, coming into Tampa Bay. And their hope is to be able to drain those dams and pour all the water into Tampa Bay. And down here at Charlotte Harbor, we're threatened by phosphate companies that want to expand and pour more of their toxic waste into public waters that will adversely, obviously, affect our ability to have drinking water. And in Minnesota, the land of sky blue waters, when I came out in 1957, it was the Hamm's beer ads, all those funny little animals running around clean water, touting the clean water virtues of Minnesota. Now something like 57% of all our lakes and streams are already placed in jeopardy. And we have a government that is standing by, making certain that the special interests get their way and ignore not just the warnings of climate change, but also the warnings against taking further risk. I wrote to Governor Walz, to all the leaders of the House and the Senate on both parties, and asked them if they could put aside all the differences that we've had over the last several years on mining and simply take inventory of what Minnesota has in terms of clean water, so that we can tell the future, the younger generation, that we do have an adequate supply of clean water for your survival. Not one of those people, not one, has had the courtesy to even respond, let alone take a lead position. Now ask yourself, how does man deal with a deadline of 12 years, maybe 15, when it refuses to take inventory of the assets and the status of its current supply, and refuses to acknowledge that it has to cease the risks that it's currently taking in terms of the quality of its air, its water, its soil, etc. So the issue that I think we ought to discuss today is, what is it that has to be done to get the kinds of leaders, forget about political parties, but the kinds of leaders necessary to focus on the most challenging issues that confront man?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and definitely it's kind of at the core of our struggle is this kind of talk about environmental regulations and leadership of all sorts. And I think an interesting place to maybe start that conversation would be to hear and think about kind of the beginning of Earth Day and the kind of the strengthening environmental movement. And I know, Chuck Dayton, you were involved. I think you told me you drove the president of the Sierra Club for the first Earth Day celebration. And I would love to hear from you kind of your thoughts on the energy that went into those early Earth Day and that, activism, environmental movement, kind of what was happening then, and if there's anything we might carry with us from that.
Well, Earth Day was a big deal, and it was mostly carried by young people and college students who were outraged by a river catching on fire or oil spills in Santa Barbara or proposals to dam up the Grand Canyon. We had never even heard of climate change at that point. And they were just starting to measure the level of carbon dioxide on the mountain in Hawaii that tipped us off. But I got very involved in the Sierra Club at that point, which had like 50 members. has now got 20,000, something like in Minnesota. And on the first Earth Day, I was asked to chauffeur the president of the Sierra Club around, who spoke at the university. Actually, the first Earth Day was important to the history of the Friends of the Boundary Waters, because Ralph Nader came to the campus and proposed that the students tax themselves $1 per student per quarter to form the Minnesota Public Interest Research Group, which they did. And I was their first lawyer. And we found out that logging was going on inside the Boundary Waters canoe area. And we started a lawsuit challenging that. Unfortunately, there was a Forest Service researcher named Bud Heinzelman, who had spent much of his life studying the forests up there and was terribly frustrated by the fact that they were logging in the wilderness. So he became I subpoenaed him to testify, and he became my star witness, and the judge fell in love with him. And we won the lawsuit to require an impact statement, but we couldn't get rid of logging through the litigation. So we went to Congress and passed legislation after about a 3-year fight to ban logging and ban mining, ban snowmobiling, and most of the motorboating. And I just have had, responsive to what Arnie was saying, it was a time of great change and great enthusiasm. And that's why I got caught up with it and left my law firm and went to work for a bunch of college students. But I have a feeling that that the pendulum is swinging in that direction, that there's enthusiasm building now that I haven't seen in a while. So while what Arnie says about money in politics and the cynical politicians that we have to deal with is all true, I have a sense that there's a movement for change. And if it is pushed hard, particularly by young people, that it could succeed, and we could again see a swelling of interest and action. I mean, to try to get legislation passed now of the type that we passed in the Minnesota legislature when Arnie was there as an environmentally sensitive Republican, it would be impossible. Can't even get bills heard. And because everybody felt like we had to do something about the environment. It's not there now. The climate, for some reason that I don't quite understand, climate change has been a political issue, a party issue, which is crazy. So it's hard. I'm going to be 82 next month. And my fervent hope is that I'm around long enough to see the curve of carbon dioxide level off and head downwards before I check out. That's enough for me.
Well, I think that's a great point about kind of the importance back then at the beginning of the founding of the Friends of kind of college students and young folks building momentum and kind of being a force behind some of the political actions that ended up happening. And Nyana, I'm wondering if you could just touch upon kind of some of the things that you've seen or been part of in organizing high schoolers and other young folks, whether that is about climate or other issues. If you could talk just about some of the energy that you see there.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of energy with young folks relating to climate issues, especially the intersectionality between climate change and racial issues and gender issues, because everything is connected, and young people are tackling a lot of the problems that people haven't in previous generations. And I think that there is a lot of urgency in a sense with our generation, because we will see a lot of the impacts of climate change that other generations won't. And, you know, our generation is thinking about, we even have kids? Is this going to be a safe planet in 1 decade, 2 decades? So I just think that it's a slightly different angle that we're coming in at, because we've been raised knowing that climate change exists. It's existed for our entire lives. And a lot of people are just learning about climate change more recently. And, you know, I think that it's really amazing that young people are mobilizing, educating people to make sure that, you know, people really know what's going on, and we're all getting the facts and stuff. And I think one of the biggest things and the most important things is just the education that goes around it. And there have been a lot of efforts to get climate justice education in our curriculum and make that required, so future generations will also know about climate change. There are a lot of really amazing things going on with the youth, and I'm really proud to be a part of it.
Thank you. Yeah, and grateful that you're kind of helping to do all of that organizing work. I know, Sarah, that you're involved kind of in the environmental education piece of things, and I'm hoping that you could kind of continue that point that Nyana was making about kind of education and the importance of sharing knowledge that way.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I work as an environmental educator and wilderness guide, and take a lot of high school students into the Boundary Waters and other wilderness areas. And I think, you know, a huge piece is getting kids who don't have the opportunities to be out in those spaces, reaching underrepresented populations. And then exactly building off Nyana, it's recognizing these intersections between, you know, environmental degradation and marginalized populations having those biggest effects, and educating young people about the implications of climate change, and coming at it from a position of what can we do, how can we address this. And I think there's a lot of possibility when we have that knowledge and that understanding about what's happening, and we think critically about the sources that our information comes from, and then, you know, think about what are solutions to some of these things that we're facing.
Definitely. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is like kind of this generation that I consider myself part of folks that grew up, you know, hearing about climate change all the time, now out in the working world and in some of these more, you know, environmental organizations, and to kind of changing that narrative and the way that we think about things to include some of that intersectionality, to bring kind of climate to the forefront. And I think that is kind of an ever-growing and increasing change that we are seeing. Claire, I know that when we were chatting earlier, you had kind of some thoughts about engagement and kind of the importance of Earth Day and, you know, environmentalism more broadly as it relates to engaging more people, and wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Claire Shirley. Again, I run Sawbill Canoe Outfitters up here right on the edge of the Boundary Waters. You can see the Superior National Forest out my windows here. So I'm located just 24 miles inland from Tofty. I'm right there, living in it every day. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, Chuck's point that he brought up earlier about how in the 70s there was this like groundswell of interest in the outdoors and interest in engagement. And that is not the first time that I've heard that time period be compared to more recently. And I think especially when we talk about the pandemic and how that has shifted people's perspectives and changed people's behaviors. I know as an outfitter up here, we were really busy in 2020. So there were a lot of people visiting the Boundary Waters and the National Forest and coming up north. And there was just this great resurgence in an interest in the outdoor world. And I think it was, you know, there was a lot to that. There was a lot of, well, there's nothing else to do. We can't go anywhere else. Things are closed. The outdoors are safe. But then there was also this, I think, more deep-seated need for respite that people felt. a deep-seated need to reconnect with the natural world and be somewhere that still made sense to people. And so we saw a lot of people camping for the first time or for the first time in a long time, bringing their families. We get a ton of families up here. So I have had lots of conversations with people that were around in the 70s and are here now and see that sort of same groundswell happening again, which is great because that's really key. One of the reasons I love doing what I do, helping people experience the Boundary Waters, is because I really believe that experiencing something really breeds a connection to it. So there are a lot of people who are really invested in these environmental causes and issues in theory, and then they come and experience it, and it really makes it tangible and really just breeds a lot of respect and ownership over those concepts and that sort of fight to carry forward. So I think one of the important things is it can feel really like a doom spiral sometimes, right? Like you talk about all these things and these fights and how long it's been and how there's, still threats to places like the Boundary Waters, whether that threat is coming from climate change, whether it's coming from mining, whether it's coming from other special interest groups, whether it's coming from overuse or misuse or threats to the Wilderness Act. It's very easy to get sort of like worked up about that. And I have been guilty of that too. I mean, I live those things every day. I live here every day. I think about them every single day. But I think the important thing to remember is that there is a place for everybody in this fight or in this effort. There is absolutely a place for everyone. There is no reason that you have to live in Minnesota or that you need to have some sort of special education or, have the ear of somebody important or higher up. I mean, there is a place for everyone and a way to engage. And that's one of the great things about this time frame too, as opposed to the 70s. There is the internet and social media and ways to connect with each other and with groups like the Friends who are doing that great work. If what you have to contribute is just sharing those messages on your social media platforms or to your friends and family, that's great. That's meaningful. That's impactful. In a day and age when people don't tune into the media like they used to, sharing those messages on personal platforms is really impactful. Whether you're attending events, whether they're virtual or in person, that's a really great way to stay engaged too, or volunteer at these events. Donating money, if you have even a couple of dollars, there are groups where that makes a huge difference in their ability to bring things up the ladder. Calling officials, when these groups put out the plea to call your officials, call your legislators, make your voice heard. That's something that you can do too. So anyway, there's a way to be involved. There's a way to do that. Groups like the Friends are doing an excellent job of engaging people. And so that's what I view Earth Day as anymore. It's a great way for me to engage and others to engage with each other, to see who's out there, who's doing good work, and figure out ways where you can sort of plug yourself in depending on what your passion is.
Great. Well, I want to give other panelists a chance to respond to anything that's been said so far. Otherwise, I see that we have had some folks answer questions down below. All right. Well, I see that in the Q&A, John had said, Chuck, the young college students you spoke of regarding the first Earth Day are now becoming senior citizens. What are your thoughts on rekindling their passion and re-energizing that group? And kind of why do we lose our way on some of these environmental issues? And it looks like your mute is still on.
I think the main thing we could do is give money at this point, but it's still possible to show up, and the world belongs to those who show up. I sat in on a discussion with Representative Stauber the other day that was organized by the Interfaith Power and Light group. Or it was supposed to be there. It ended up with his staff person, but there's innumerable ways to be involved. Just look on the website of any of the organizations, particularly the Friends of the Boundary Waters. And why did we lose our way? I don't know. For a long time, Earth Day was just sort of like not much to not much, it seems to me. And I like the idea of trying to reinvigorate it, rededicate ourselves to it. Someone said, you know, young people worry about, should I bring a child into this world? My gosh, what could be more motivating than that, to think about making the world safe for your kids? And I'm excited about, for example, what happened in Georgia, that shows that with the leadership of Stacey Abrams, they were able to take over the Senate of the United States. Amazing, you know. So one person with a message and a cause can be a leader.
Nayan, I see you kind of nodding along to that in agreement, and wondered if you have anything to add in terms of kind of like the political involvement that you see in your peers and leadership there.
In terms of the Boundary Waters specifically?
I think however you want to take that question, and it could be Boundary Waters or a more broadly kind of energizing about environmental issues.
Yeah. Well, I know that there have been a lot of walkouts, which of course we're just getting back in school. But that has been a really important part of what youth have been doing. And I mean, just things like walking out of school are a really good way to show adults and people who might not be as in tune to what's going on with climate change and climate bills and everything. It's a really big thing and a big symbolic thing to walk out of school and to kind of show adults that this is important to us, and it's worth missing school because it is our future in the end. And I'm trying to think of other climate efforts. I don't know, I guess I would assume that there are a lot of adults in here, maybe some educators. I guess I would just say support your students, support your kids and what they're doing. We have a long road ahead of us to have climate equity, especially for our most marginalized communities who are affected by climate change. And there's a lot of work to be done. So support people financially, listen to young people, listen to Black and Indigenous environmentalists, because yeah, they're the ones who have really been leading this movement from the beginning of time. And so we should be following them and listening to them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about kind of focusing on some of those voices and issues, as, you know, recognizing that folks have been in this fight for a long time and have been leading it. Claire, I saw that you looked like you were about to say something, so I will let you go ahead.
Yeah, just listening to Nayana speak about all the young people who are already using their voices and using the power that they do have to walk out of school. It's very inspiring. And I'm sort of in this middle ground between, you know, the new up and coming energy from people that have, you know, like myself, that have sort of grown up knowing that climate change is a thing, but I exist in between these generations where I also am sometimes closer to the folks who helped the, you know, Wilderness Act pass in the first place. So I appreciate the perspectives on both sides, and I like living in this middle ground, but I think it's also really important. I've seen some questions floating around out there about how do we, the folks who, you know, helped push this movement forward the first time, how can we be of service again, and how can we help it move forward? And I would say to keep your eyes and ears open for these young leaders who are emerging, and to, when you see those young leaders who have that spark, who have that, like, you know, that intangible X factor, you can tell from your experience. You can see, you've seen it before in other leaders like Paul Wellstone. You can identify those people with your wealth of experience, and you can help elevate them and help give them the platform that they don't have inherently just because of their youth or inexperience. But I know that you sort of, as you know, move through your career, move through these causes, you can identify those people, and you can really help elevate them, lift them, support them, and help them push forward. And I think that's a really important thing to, it's not simply just passing the baton, right? It's like helping bring those people up.
Great. Yeah. Sarah, I know when we had chatted earlier, you kind of were talking about, different ways of thinking about the environment, whether that's reflecting on colonialism or other kind of historical things that might tie into this conversation, and wondered if you could just talk about that a little bit and kind of some of your thoughts that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, I would just say that, a big reflection that I've been having is kind of these points of environmental crises that started the first Earth Day and, led to the Clean Air, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. We are also in a time of environmental crisis, and we know this. But what I think is a really big thing for me that needs to be a bigger part of the modern day environmentalist movement is recognizing environmental justice and, thinking about colonization and these things that we think about as historical are the same things that we're doing today to the earth. And it's, the fossil fuel industry, extraction, industrialization, all of these things are having just detrimental impacts on the environment. And, it is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are having the largest impacts of climate change and all of this environmental degradation. And so we need to have our environmental movement align with social justice movements. And we need to be thinking about how to support Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And if we are not aligning those issues, we are not going to have change, and we're going to be leaving out, a huge part of our population. And I think that, thinking about the history of clean air and clean water, if it's not clean air and clean water for everyone, then we're not doing our job to support all the people. And so I think that's really how I see the current and the future environmental movement and what Earth Day needs to stand for.
But I would like you to be a little bit more specific about what you're thinking about. How does environmental justice exactly, give me some examples of issues where environmental justice can be better served?
Oh yeah, definitely. So environmental justice, is really that the environmental benefits and burdens are distributed fairly across communities, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. So things like having access to clean water, clean air, having access to...
Specific, Sarah.
Okay, yeah, I'll get there. So things like, in terms of environmental burdens, that where we dispose our waste, where we have nuclear plants, where we do our extraction of fossil fuels, those are, closer to places where Black, Indigenous, and people of color live. And so they're the ones that are having the burdens. They're the ones that have the highest burdens of air and water pollution. And so if we keep doing these things, as long as we're continuing to do these things, it's having a disproportionate effect on marginalized populations. And
so I think to jump in and kind of tie it to some of the Boundary Waters related things, one thing that at Friends we think about a lot is, for example, like the polymet mine that would infringe on kind of wild rice areas that the Fond du Lac use. Right. And that would, if there was a spill or other mine pollution, would really harm some of the folks living up in the Fond du Lac Reservation, would harm access to drinking water for the city of Duluth. And so I think like that's a really kind of prime example of why this is something that is connected to all sorts of conversations about conservation and politics and environmentalism. Because like that does have that tangible impact. And I think, yeah, Sarah, that was just like a very, very strong point that we have to kind of have this more critical lens and overall thinking. Otherwise, we're going to keep ending up in the same situations over and over again, where people are harmed, by these pollution, by these decisions, and are not benefiting economically from it.
Thank you for bringing it up.
If I may, I'd like to make a couple of comments. I remember in history, there was a saint in the Catholic Church, and I can't recall his name now, who was a notorious womanizer, but yet he wanted to rise up to a high position in the church. So his famous prayer was, "Oh Lord, make me pure, but oh, not yet." And that's kind of what's happened to the environmental movement. We have political leadership that very comfortably talks about what they want to do in 2050. We even have states passing laws about the virtue they're going to have in 2050. But let me ask this panel, can you name me 3 political leaders in office today that are leading the fight to prevent the polymet permit from going forth? You have 201 legislators and you got 4 constitutional officers. Can you name 3 that are leading on polymet?
I will just jump in and say that we do have many legislators who are most of them are some of the more progressive Democrats of the Minnesota legislature who are working with us on the Prove It First legislation. And I'll kind of name drop Jen McEwen is a great legislator from Duluth, who's our lead author in the Senate. And I think is a great example of kind of a new generation of folks in the legislature
Can you name
willing
2
to lead on
others?
this.
Name
Well,
2
we
others.
have something like 50 something co-signers on this legislation. And so there are folks that are working with us on this. And I think, to differing extents of leadership there.
Can I bring you up to date? Let me bring you up to date on that, because that's a very good point. The House allows 35 people to sign onto a bill. In this case, on Prove It First, 35 Democrats signed on to the Prove It First legislation. Now that constitutes 50% of the total members of their caucus. And yet they haven't been able to get a single hearing. And not one of them, not one, is willing to make the motion to move it out of committee. Not one of them is willing to go public on why we can't get a public hearing. And not one is willing to attach that bill as an amendment to another bill. In reality is what you have is this, and I'll tell you this because I sat at your banquet 2 years ago and I sat next to a legislator. And I can tell you he was totally indifferent to your concerns. And I asked him, why was he here? And he said, it looks good on my literature. The honest truth, I don't think we're going to make any progress if we delude ourselves into thinking that people support our cause when they're not willing to lift a single finger to it. The truth of the matter is, when you weigh the $6 million that comes into a caucus versus the voices that you're talking about, take a wild guess who wins, hands down. There has not been one single public hearing. And not one legislator has spoken out publicly on why there's no public hearing, not one.
Yeah, and I think so there's a couple of different things going into that. And I think part of that is kind of our political gridlock and some Democratic leadership. I do want to kind of draw the attention back to our Earth Day conversation. I know we'll have other political webinars in the future and kind of get back to some of the comments in the chat here. I know that some people were kind of talking about, protecting the boundary waters as it relates to leave no trace ideas, as it relates to kind of like the physical protection of making sure that campsites and trails and things like that are safe and clean. And so somebody asked, they said, Claire, I'm curious how well outfitters collaborate on making sure clients do their part to keep the boundary waters clean. Whether it's leave no trace videos or other options, what does that look like from your end as an outfitter?
Yeah, totally. So I think obviously there's if you are going to issue permits, you have to work under an agreement with the Forest Service, right? So any outfitter who is issuing you permits has an agreement that we have signed with the Forest Service that says we promised to do X, Y, and Z. And that's true of like the Duluth Pack store or me or somebody over in Ely, whoever's giving you your permit. So some of those things include talking to people about leave no trace, showing them the leave no trace video, et cetera, et cetera. How that plays out in every individual business, I don't really know. I usually issue myself my own permits. I don't get them from other people. So I don't have a lot of experience with that, but I do know that it's obviously really important to us. I think people using wilderness wisely is obviously important to my business. I don't want to be sending people out into a wilderness that is trashed. There was a lot of media play about that last summer, about the Boundary Waters being trashed. I will say from personal experience up here, I went on several trips. My staff went on a lot of trips. I think it maybe was a bit overplayed, the amount of damages. It was maybe more heavily damaged in other areas, maybe not so much in the Sawdell area. I think that also is just a media story that plays well, so it got a lot of coverage. But frankly, there are always going to be some bad actors who, cut down a tree, kind of regardless of what videos you've shown them or how much you've talked about leave no trace. On the whole, though, I think some of the behavior last year that we saw were from beginners, people who just don't know, who were unprepared, who they went out there and then they brewed coffee on that first morning and they were like, shoot, what do I do with these coffee grounds? I didn't bring a plastic baggie to put them in. I just didn't know. So they put them in the fire grate or something, and that's, there was a lot more of that kind of behavior, which I am much more tolerant of because the wilderness will regenerate. It will, it's pretty resilient to some of those kind of minor infractions. And on the whole, I think it's much more valuable to have people have those experiences, help them learn, help them know how to do better next time. So a lot of us do a lot of that stuff up front, and we're certainly talking about it with groups as they go out. But not everybody goes through an outfitter, and that was a problem with the permitting system last year. It's going to be different this year. People are going to have their physical permits, either complete a quiz online or go through an outfitter like us issuing them. So yeah, it's definitely an ongoing discussion on how to responsibly use the wilderness, but that's a conversation I really enjoy having. And I find it's hardly ever adversarial. People want to learn and want to know those things. And it's just, showing them the way.
What I worry about is lead sinkers for loons because they pick up little stones to help their digestion, and they pick up lead sinkers and it kills them. And I wonder if the Forest Service or outfitters are trying to do anything on that. There should be legislation on it, but nobody's got the political will to carry something that's going to make people take things out of their tackle box, at least so far.
Yeah, that'd be super helpful. I mean, speaking personally, we don't sell lead tackle in our store, and that's just a personal choice that we make. But it would be helpful if it was a more widespread regulation for sure. But yeah, that's definitely a major concern.
Talk to your Forest Service friends and tell them to put that into the lecture.
I want to go back to Claire's point about kind of like the excitement that bringing new people into the Boundary Waters is a good thing. Introducing more new faces to that space is maybe a challenge in some ways if people don't know, but also is kind of ultimately really a goal of the Friends and of a lot of other organizations. And Nyana, I know that you had mentioned a minute ago that you were kind of involved in bringing other students up on trips, and wanted to hear just a little bit about your experience with that and kind of what kind of things you're thinking about when you're leading new folks in the Boundary Waters.
Yeah. So just for some background, 2 years ago, I led trips with the Bold Gold program through the YMCA, which provides really, really good scholarships, mostly just free trips for youth who live in Minnesota and usually wouldn't have access to camps, especially in places like the Boundary Waters, because unfortunately it's very inaccessible to just take a trip to the Boundary Waters if you haven't gone before, don't have that previous experience. So it's been a really important part of the Boundary Waters has been a very important part of my life, and taking a month or however long out of my summer to just spend time up there and reflect. And it's really a healing place. It's amazing. And to be able to bring or lead trips with students and people who just wouldn't have that experience usually, and to see them bond in this beautiful place is so important. And the conversations that we have up there, it's so special. And I'm really grateful that I've been able to be a part of that, because we need to just keep making the outdoors more accessible, especially the Boundary Waters, because it's in our state, but a lot of students in the Twin Cities don't even know what it is, because it's just a place that's usually only visited by, you know, a select group of maybe white middle to upper class people who can own a canoe or have the resources to pay to go on a trip through an outfit. And so just continuing to have those conversations about how inaccessible the wilderness really is, and then take action and actually find ways to get people of color and people who wouldn't be able to pay for those trips up in the wilderness is really important.
Definitely. And I think that that kind of point serves as both an equity issue, in that like anybody who wants to go should be able to have access and should be able to experience that, but also that it continues to kind of create new young environmentalists, of people who maybe would have not had an experience of going on a trip, but then are able to experience that and kind of feel some of that dedication and that passion for really understanding what's at stake and what the wilderness is like up there. I'll give folks another minute to respond to that as I read through questions. Otherwise, we can look at some of the other ones that people have been asking. I know somebody had mentioned wanting to kind of hear what the most effective way would be to contact legislators and what topic that should be on. And so I think that would be a great time for me to plug our Prove It First bill, which is the law that we're trying to work through the legislature that Arnie Carlson had mentioned earlier. And right now we're asking folks to reach out to their legislators and to Democratic leadership to ask them to support this bill. So I can put some links. I'll send out a follow-up email to everyone who's here today, and we'll link to those resources where you can contact your legislator and take action around that. I will also mention that we have a citizen action group that is kind of growing and working to contact supporters, working to write letters to the editor, things like that. And we'll put the information for that as well in a follow-up email. Chuck, I saw that looks like you wanted to say something there.
What's that? Is it the Prove It bill that you're talking about?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Maya, can I jump in with a question of my own for someone on the panel?
For sure.
Okay, great. Well, I have you all here. Arnie, this is for you. I'm wondering if you can help me think this through a little bit. And I see some of this happening in the chat too. I'm curious, there's a lot of frustration with leaders, political leaders especially. I've heard you express that today. I see a lot of people expressing that in the chat, and a lot of people wondering what to do with that frustration, where to place that energy, and how to motivate current legislators. Maybe, we've talked a little bit before about how to motivate people to run for office. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? What do we do? As just Joe Blow citizen, here I am up in Tofty. I can't just call up Governor Walz. What do I do?
Well, well, let me, if I may, just be blunt. Not that I'm known for my subtlety anyway. The reality is, we're rearranging deck chairs while the ship is sinking. I started out by talking about a 12 to a 16-year time frame, and we can't even get the state of Minnesota to focus on an inventory of its own clean water, clean air, soil, etc. And stacked against that is the enormity of the millions and millions of dollars that they themselves solicit from PACs and special interest groups to fund their campaigns. They've made it abundantly clear where they stand, and that is the protection of their incumbency. And in order to protect their incumbency, they're making compromises and accommodations to the special interest groups that we as a panel sit around cursing. So you're not going to quote persuade. I campaigned for Governor Walz. I donated money for Governor Walz, and I'm a Republican. There aren't many Democrats that run around campaigning for Republicans. And the reverse is also true. I cannot even get a phone call. I cannot get a letter. I cannot get a response. His deputy chief of staff comes from the green law firm which represents Polymet. His number 2 person and chief attorney was the Polymet outside counsel. His first appointee to the board that oversees campaign finance is with the Green law firm. The connection here is getting rather obvious. The truth of the matter is it's time for the Republican Party is hopeless, so forget about them. But if the Democratic Party does not challenge its incumbents and start to take them out in primaries, we're all going down. It's not a question of persuading or calling. Believe me, they've had ample opportunity over the past 2 years to grant one hearing, and they haven't. Bear in mind the dam that was designed in Brazil that killed 270 people and caused over $7 billion worth in damage. The consultant to that dam is the same consultant that we have in the state of Minnesota for our dam. And yet not one hearing. You have a $7 billion liability pending, and the Ways and Means Committee of both houses ignores it. $7 billion. That's 1/3 of your annual budget, and you can't get a hearing. No, those people are not going to be persuaded by a phone call. They're going to tell you what they're doing for 2050, but they're not going to tell you why they've given in today. The honest truth is we need challengers. We need people to say, I'm going to go up against these legislators. I'm going to go up against the governor. I'm going to go up against anybody that opposes us. And we're running candidates against them. I'd like to see this environmental group do precisely what the Democrats did in '73 and make an annual award to the polluter of the year. That will get their attention. That will get media attention. And award a half a dozen or so to those legislators who sit on the sidelines. And stop taking them off the hook. As Chuck can verify, if you don't have an ally in the legislature that's willing to go to the wall for you, you don't have an ally. It takes nothing to sign on to a bill and say, oh yeah, I support you. But by the way, I'm not going to do diddly squat. Because I'll tell you exactly what Polymet wants more than anything else. It wants nothing done. And that's precisely what's happening. They don't want anything done. Let the process work out. That's what they want. So I think the time has come for the Democratic Party to take a hard look at itself. And I'll tell you, as a Republican, I envy what they had going in the 70s. And I mean that sincerely. They had a group, and Chuck can attest to this, that came in that were environmentally sensitive. They were consumer sensitive, and they were for full transparency and truthfulness in the legislative process. And they gave us some of the best reforms that we have now. The current Democratic Party has tossed all that out. And they're hugging the special interest as close as they possibly can. Think about it. $200,000 for an incumbent senator. How many of you can raise anything close to that? They've turned the legislature into a money machine.
I think that's a really great point about kind of the primary challengers that you raised earlier and the importance of getting new folks, new faces in if we're not finding success in changing the minds of people who are already there. And kind of just encourage folks to, as we approach the next election cycle, which is somehow coming already, that to really stay aware of, supporting folks that do really have a great opinion on clean water, on boundary waters and other related issues, and to make that kind of part of what you're thinking about as the primaries approach.
That would be marvelous. No, challenge these people. Once they get a challenge, and once they have to debate publicly, believe me, they fold. How would you like to be an incumbent and deal with this awesome amount of money that you're getting from special interest, while but at the same time you run around saying, oh, I don't take PAC money. I don't really take special interest money. Oh, they sure do. They just launder it through the caucus. And by the way, Chuck, you're an attorney. Isn't that a conflict of interest?
Sure.
Isn't it amazing how it's a legal conflict of interest for legislators, but illegal for the rest of us in the private sector?
Yeah. Arnie, it seems to me you're saying it would be beneficial to have environmental champions
You bet.
challenge our incumbents, Democratic incumbents in the primary, even if they don't beat them.
That's correct. You're surfacing the issue. You're making your point. What Jen McEwen did has got to be copied everywhere else. It can be done. But she was talented and determined, and she had a powerful message. And you know what was interesting about that race is her opponent, what was the name, Sorensen? Somebody remember? Well, anyway, her opponent had no comeback. There is no comeback to this. I don't think you can find anyone with an IQ of room temperature that is prepared to defend the contract with the state of Minnesota. We have a contract with a shell company that has no assets, no financial resources to pay off any kind of a claim that comes against it. And Glencore, which has all the money and is going to rake in all the profits, isn't on the contract. How would you like to defend that? I'm perfectly willing, and I mean this sincerely. I will go anywhere and debate anybody on this topic. You get an office holder, I will debate them. I'd love to see the University of Minnesota conduct some public debates. That would be a tremendous step forward. We should publicly be debating our future. I'm 86 years old. I will not be around when all of this collapses.
We've got someone in the comments asking if we can
I made
clone
my point.
Arnie.
Thank you.
I think that would be a great comment on your energy and your passion for this. And I do want to be mindful that we're getting towards the end of the hour that we had set aside for this conversation. I see kind of going through the chat and through the comments that there's just a lot of folks that are excited about, you know, this energy of recognizing that we need politicians that are going to kind of better serve the interests of clean water, of people's health, of, you know, the safety for the environment and all of that. And I think that that kind of just ties me back to some of these themes that we've been talking about, where the first Earth Day was about that kind of groundswell of community support, and recognizing that, you know, clean air and water are these really essential things for Minnesotans and for everybody across the globe. And to kind of, bring that back. That's exactly what we're trying to work on. That's what all of you are so dedicated to. And really grateful that you're all able to be here today and to kind of talk with us about this. I wanted to give just a minute for anyone to have kind of final closing thoughts from the panel.
Well, there's a nice comment that says, "Hurrah for grumpy old men. Let's clone Arnie." I agree.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. I'll tell you, I would love it if these young people could contact me. My email is govarnie@gmail.com. I'm trying to rally college students to do precisely what MPIRG did. You can't believe how powerful MPIRG was in the state legislature. So if young people will only gather and unite, we can do wonders. We're just simply trying to get a water study. And I understand that your organization has agreed to sponsor it. That's going to be a powerful, powerful document.
Definitely. Yeah, it really is about just continuing to build all of that support, build that momentum. Anybody else want to say a few closing things? Otherwise, I've got a link that I want to make sure I share.
I just want to say thanks for inviting me and for letting me be included here today. It was really great to hear everybody's perspectives, and thanks to both Chuck and Arnie in particular for providing the support. I think it's
our delight from a couple of old timers.
It's great. It can be really scary sometimes as like a young business owner, and I've got little kids at home, and I feel like a lot of my career is ahead of me. I'm also a lawyer in Minnesota, and it feels sometimes a little threatening and a little bit like, you know, I have a lot at stake. I got little kids. I got a family business, you know, trying to keep alive. It can feel really scary. So it's nice to hear that level of support coming from folks like you that
well, thank you.
Yourself out there and take a strong stance on these things, and that you're going to have.
Well, I think together we can.
That's really important to hear. So I appreciate that. And my takeaway from all of this is that, Nyana, when you're ready to run for office, you can call me and I'll be your coordinator in northern Minnesota.
There you go.
That's
Maya,
great.
can we
I'd vote
access,
for you. Yes.
can we access the comments after you shut down?
I can send folks a list of all the comments and we can try to respond to some of the folks that had questions and stuff. I also wanted to mention that I'm putting in the chat right now a link to a green gathering that we are co-hosting on Earth Day. So this will be next Thursday, April 22nd. We're working with Minnesota Environmental Partnership and a couple other organizations to host what we're calling an Earth Day Green Gathering. And this is basically a place for anyone that's interested that considers themselves to be involved in working to protect the environment to join, and you can chat. It's very informal. It'll be like a video chat where you can drop into different rooms and locations and talk with people who are also kind of involved in the fight. So that is in the chat and it will be in a follow-up email as well. So I hope some of you are able to attend. I see Craig says, run Nyana. Other people saying that they would vote for you. So I think that's a great note to end on, kind of just feeling excited about some of the work that young people especially are doing, and that really all of you are, you know, working so hard to be advocates for clean water and for the boundary waters. And I really appreciate that and really appreciate the time that you took today to be on this panel and discuss with all of us. So thanks everybody for joining. Please feel free to reach out to me by email if you have any questions or any other follow-up. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Great, thank you.
Thanks
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.